jump so high you die from impact on landing? Maybe you don't think zombies is hard enough and you want 32 of the bastards on round 1 all running full sprint with vending machines that eat your money and berate you afterwards. Perhaps you have aspirations of being a wood-burning stove. No? Then how about a perk machine? Maybe you are an armchair zombies player. Maybe zombies bore you to death. Or maybe it gives you wood or makes you pitch a tent. Well, then maybe you want to play capture the flag with the zombies. In that case, you've come to the right series. I'm Trey, and throughout this series I intend to teach you how to script your wildest dreams into zombies. Like, subscribe, and get ready to program your dream zombies map. In today's tutorial, we will go over how to script a simple physics mod that can be toggled with the trigger. In this example, I am using a trigger damage, but you can use whatever trigger you like, such as trigger use or trigger radius. Note, the scripting will be slightly different on those other triggers, but I will show you how to make adjustments to use the other trigger types. So let's get started. First things first, you need to go into your map and set up a trigger to use for this. As stated, I use trigger damage, so this is what mine looks like, and here's the setup I used. This is set up to only work with melee damage, so it can't accidentally be triggered. Also, you should probably place an object to indicate the location of your trigger. In this example, I did not because I placed it right behind another trigger that has an object. Now give your trigger a target name and save it. Now onto the code. This code uses a simple state machine to toggle between the default and modified values, a toggle switch if you will. So onto the explanation. This first line gets the trigger object as we have done in other videos, and you may notice no other lines of code setting trigger hint strings or cursor hints. Well, with trigger damage, it does not show any icon or hint string, as these type of triggers are only meant to be activated by damage. The same is true for trigger radius, except they are activated by walking into them as long as they are scripted correctly. The next line is a variable used as our toggle state. I used a number here, but you could use a string instead, and that would look like this. Next, we are creating a variable to represent our user or player, and this is set to undefined for now. Next, we create an infinite loop. In this example, I used a while loop with 1 as the condition. You could also use true as the condition, or use a for loop with 2 semicolons in it. Next, inside this infinite loop, we will tell the trigger to wait until an event, and the event is trigger and user. What happens here is when the player activates the trigger, the undefined user becomes the player that activated it. After this event, we create a switch block to toggle the states of activation, our toggle switch, or as it's called in programming, a state machine. We pass our switch the variable trigger counter to use to determine the state. Now we place in our case 0 in my example. If you use the string, it will be the string you are using as the deactivated state. The first instruction is to change the state to activated, so in my case, this would be trigger counter ++ to increment the counter to 1. If you use the string, you would set the string equal to whatever string value you want to use to represent activated. Next, we will call the setClientDvar function on the user and give it the arguments of jump height as a string and the desired value. In this example, I used 1000. I believe this is the max value that could be passed, but feel free to tinker around with it to your liking. And again, we call the function setClientDvar on the user and the arguments of gravity as a string and the desired value. Take note, lower values equal floatier movement. This affects all movement, not just jumps, so if you run up a slope, you will float off of it more with lower values. Again, play around with this value to your liking. And finally, we again call the function setClientDvar on the user with the arguments of gspeed as a string, and again pass the desired value. This will change your movement speed. And finally, we break out of the switch and we sit at the wait till until the trigger is toggled. And when this happens, we go to our second case. This will be our activated state, and here in my example, this would be 1. If you use the string, you will place the string used to represent activated. Next, we decrement the trigger counter variable trigger counter --. If you use the string, you will set the trigger counter equal to the string you used to represent the deactivated state. And here we do the same 3 function calls on our user to set them back to the Treyarch defaults. Jump height's default is 39, gravity's default is 800, and speed's default is 190. And that's it. Congratulations, you create a physics mod for your map that changes gravity, speed, and jump height. So now let's take a look at code changes for other trigger types. First up is trigger use, and the only difference is you will be setting the cursor hint using the desired hint icon, or in this example, hint no icon. And if you choose, you could add a hint string to pop up when you get in activation range of the trigger. You could also create a cost variable if you want to make it buyable, and add some code to make the trigger buyable as shown here. Now on to trigger radius, and this one's a bit different because it's activated by overlapping its collision. So the first thing you may notice is we have a variable storing the players. After this, you may notice we have the trigger waiting with a wait till with the arguments of trigger and who. Who is basically a macro and is used for cases like this to determine what player or who activated the trigger. Next, you may notice we have a for loop in our for loop, and this is to iterate through the players we stored in the variable we created earlier. Next, we have an if statement checking a condition, and that condition is if the current player is touching self? What the fuck, you pervert? Do you gotta do that in public? Hold on, let's rewrite this code to reflect this player's disgusting actions. Ah yes, that's more accurate to the situation at hand. Anyway, next you may notice we have a wait 5 just outside of our switch block. So, what are the differences in code for? Well, let's start with the wait first since it's the most important change. This clip demonstrates why the wait is important. As you see with the example code I wrote for this clip, the code executes so fast it would toggle between the two states so rapidly that it would be a lottery if it is active or inactive when you exit the trigger's collision. So, in short, the wait is needed to give time to ensure the player is out of the trigger's collision before looping back around the code. And that's basically it. Now, you could write the script to be like our trigger damage as shown here, but let's be honest, that's less fun. Also, I'm trying to teach, so showing the same code for everything wouldn't demonstrate different methods to achieve the same goal. Well, with that out of the way, my next video will be on creating your own custom teleporters. And in this one, we'll also learn how to use external scripts. And it's just that simple. We have covered how to program this physics mod multiple ways based on trigger types. We also covered how to make a buyable variant using a modified version of the trigger use code. And now it's up to you to implement this code in your map the way you want using the system I created for you. One last thing before I go, I want to show you a way to write the trigger radius code in a more advanced way to confuse your newbie programmer friends. Yes, that's right. You can omit the variable storing the players and just get the players directly in the for loop and check the index of the players returned in the if statement. Then call the setClientDvar function on the indexed player of the getPlayers function. And that is everything. So go on and make your map with Halo 2 super jumps and have fun. Hope to catch you in the next one.